All right. Hello and welcome from intention to impact, leveraging the supporting innovative practices blueprint framework to build, scale, and sustain inclusive systems. Presented by the singular Dr. Andrew Wall. I'm Dr. Caitlin Hendricks-Petiti, a program specialist with SIP, and I am thrilled to be your moderator for this breakout session. First, I want to go over a few logistics. This session is being recorded and will be archived on the conference agenda page after the conference for 1 month, and then on the SIP website after that. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen toolbar at the bottom. There's also the interpretation icon in that same area. It looks like the international symbol for a globe on the bottom right-hand corner and with access to Spanish translation. We will be making sure that our ASL interpreters are spotlit along with the PowerPoint and our presenter. Please make sure that your volume is muted to avoid any background distractions while our presenters are speaking, but please use the chat to participate. Let us know if you have questions. We encourage you to engage whenever possible. And if you keep your cameras on, we can see your faces. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Wall, whose leadership was instrumental in building the SIP project and continues to help shape its growth. With Dr. Wall, best practice is never just a phrase, it is the foundation that he brings to the work. His guidance has helped SIP apply the same practices that we encourage in others, using data, reflection, and honest examination of our systems to strengthen our impact for students. And with that, Dr. Wall, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin, so much. Well, I'm thrilled to be with you all. Um, so hello on this wonderful Thursday morning. I hope you all are doing well. My task over the next 55 minutes or so is to, number one, entertain you, make it interesting. And that's sometimes a challenge and associated with data, but I take that challenge on, I take it seriously. So I want first and foremost for you to enjoy our time together. What that means practically, I'm going to ask you to participate in the chat. I'm going to have some questions intentionally in that regard. We're going to do a couple breakout rooms. So I think we have the logistics for that set up. Just be aware we will have an interpreter breakout room. We'll have a Spanish breakout room. So we're going to try to be very intentional, but give you some opportunity to discuss things. I want to start by engaging you by asking you some questions. So that's where we'll begin. Then we're going to spend some time thinking about two big questions. Okay. Those two big questions are around thinking about whether something works and how something works. And in the midst of talking about whether something works and how something works, we're going to have a simultaneous discussion both about inclusion and inclusion practices, and at the same time, we're going to talk about the use of evidence, right? Because I know you all use evidence in different ways, and so we're going to talk about some of the use of evidence. Does that sound okay? I love feedback, so you can shake your heads if that all sounds good. Okay, to get us started, a lot of what I'm going to do is actually, from an information standpoint, was in a policy brief. And so I'm putting in the chat that policy brief. It's a link to it, sort of as background information for you to take away. So just know that that's some background information. But let me really begin with a question to you. So I want you to think about this and then drop an answer in the chat. When was the last time evidence changed your mind? When was the last time that some sort of evidence changed your mind? And if it's really easy to come up with that, then I want you to think about when was the last time you changed your behavior based upon a set of evidence? Everybody got a time in their mind? Okay, keep put them in the chat. Give us a couple of examples so everyone can see. I want to give you one of mine because I actually know that the research on the use of evidence actually suggests that it is not actually true that more evidence results in people changing their mind. And the example I always give is climate science. So instead of talking about inclusion, let's talk about climate science for just a second. If someone believes in climate science and we give them all the evidence that the climate is changing, that tends to reinforce their belief. If someone doesn't believe in climate in the climate changing, and we give them a whole bunch of evidence that the climate is changing, do you know what actually happens? It actually reinforces their prior belief about what they believed before. So it's really interesting that, this idea of evidence and the use of evidence and what confirms and what's disconfirming. And that's why I ask you the question about when was the last time you either changed your mind or your behavior associated with evidence. And I want to start out and really give you a personal example. So I've recently been doing a little experiment, right? I needed to increase the amount that I was sleeping. Now, I happen to know from the evidence that sleep is really related to your health. So I went on this whole project to increase sleep, and I did a little pre-study, and I found out I was actually only sleeping about 6.5 hours a night. Okay. And I'm like, I should be sleeping more than that. And so I did 4 interventions, okay, in order to try to improve my sleep. I changed my sleep routine. That's what all the sleep experts tell you to do. So I changed my sleep routine and my sleep increased just marginally. I created a really consistent routine. And then I did a whole set of mindfulness practices. And I thought, well, if I reduce my stress, if I do mindfulness practices, that's really going to change my sleep. And guess what? A little tiny increase in sleep, not really, it's not really clear. And then I just so happened that on a night our house was really cold and I slept really well. And I thought, oh my gosh, I might sleep better when the house is cold. And so then I set the temperature to 62 degrees in our house. And lo and behold, my sleep improved pretty significantly. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I could have never predicted that. And then my wife said, you know what you really need to do is you really need to reduce sugar and carbohydrates in your diet. And if you do that, I bet your sleep is going to improve. And I got to tell you something. I didn't believe that to be true at all, but I did it for 1 week and I had the single greatest increase in my sleep score and my hours of sleep. And diet was the single biggest impact. And I'm like, that can't be true. But the evidence is actually completely clear, right? And so it is, in fact, now I've changed my mind that actually the thing that's most important to my sleep is diet. An example of evidence impacting, right? Now, how it works and what it works is what we're going to talk about. So if we use that example, I'm not exactly sure of the pathophysiology of diet. Okay, that's a very fancy word. I'm not really sure how that impacts sleep. All I know is that it does. Okay. And so that's really where I want to start today is us thinking about whether something works, and then we're going to talk about how it works. And along the way, I want you to continue to think about evidence that I share that is either confirming or disconfirming to your prior beliefs. So let's start with inclusion in the state of California. So, one of the things that you may or may not be aware of is that inclusion in the state of California actually lags some of national data. So, this is particularly looking at measure 5A, which is the percent of students with disabilities who spend 80 more percent of their time in a general education classroom. We could use a series of other indicators, but it is actually the case that California has lagged national averages for some time. And so the good news is that as you look at this trend line, that the gap is closing, that California is closing sort to the national average. But I think every state wants to aspire to be a leader in its educational practices. I know California does. And this is an area where we still have tremendous growth that is still possible, right? And I would frame it as possible. Okay, so now let me have you reflect again. So is this evidence confirming your prior beliefs or is it challenging your prior beliefs? Right? Just hold that as a thought, right? Because you're either going to believe and you're going to say, well, I knew that to be true, or, maybe you're like, hey, that's not what I believe to be true. I thought we were doing really differently. And so I think that's a really interesting. I want you to think about those feelings, right? So I told you we're going to operate at 2 levels. Talk about the use of evidence and the data itself. Because I know that when you're working in your districts and with your teachers, with their administrators, that you have to realize that just because you have good evidence doesn't necessarily mean that's going to carry the day in changing people's viewpoints. But I think this is an important place to start, okay? Because then we can ask the question, well, what does work in terms of making change to create more inclusive environments. And I want to be careful as we talk about this that the SIP project, and I firmly believe this, we use a set of indicators, right? Like the measure 5A, that's about 80% of students with disabilities in a general education classroom. Okay, we use that. But the definition of inclusion is much broader. Okay, that the definition of inclusion is about belonging. It's about access to the general education curriculum, right? It's about outcomes. So it is much broader than simply thinking about inclusion, but we about any measure. But we use that as a way, right, to begin to approximate what's going on. And so one of the things that I've been really pleased to do is to work with the SIP project over the years and to track data and ask the question, does participation in a statewide systems improvement project, does that actually move the needle, okay, towards greater inclusion? Now, again, with the limitations of our measure, right? But we ask that question, and what we find is the answer is absolutely yes, it does. And so when we look at the very first cohort that entered the SIP project more than 10 years ago now, we see that they actually entered at the time below the state average. Okay. Because their 5A measure was only 47%, the state average was 54%. And then we see in that period of time from 2016 to 2024, the movement of those LEAs in the SIP, working in the SIP project, actually has moved from 47% to 65%. And that same period of time, you see the movement in California overall went from 54 to 60%. Okay. So the delta change is much more significant for participants in the SIP project. And if you look at it nationally, that's also, sort of, you have the same story emerges. So this doesn't tell us how it works, right? But it tells us that in terms of districts, LEAs engaged in a systems improvement process, that they can make real change in key measures, right? That are proxies for this broader concept of inclusion. Okay. Now, again, I ask you, confirming or disconfirming evidence, right? Your experience may be, hey, this is our experience, or it may be, I didn't know, it tells me something new. Okay, well, then I might say, as a research person, I might actually think, well, that's all well and good, but that's not a true comparative design. And so what you're really experiencing is those districts that participate in the SIP project, they want to be there. They're set up to do change. And so that predisposes them to be the districts that already would have made positive change anyway. Okay? So then we look at what if we look at those districts that are a part of the SIM process who are also working with SIP in terms of a system, a process of systems change. And what if we compare what they accomplished to the national and the state? And what we observe, right, because this is a much shorter time frame, is the same trend persists. That we see those SIM participating LEAs and districts make much more improvement than the state on average in the same time frame, even though they aren't that voluntary group who might be really predisposed to wanting to do systems improvement, um, change related to inclusion. Okay, now let me ask again. I told you I'd keep coming back to it. Confirming or disconfirming in your mind? Does this challenge your perception of what might be occurring? Do you, like, for instance, do you believe that, when LEAs get into the SIM process that they make change? Or maybe you perceive that they don't make change. So it's curious, but this again is just focusing on, does something work? It's not telling us if it works. Okay. That's a really important difference because we may say, well, it works, but we don't really know how this happens. Um, so sometimes these data challenges, right? They really confirm or they disconfirm our beliefs. Let me go one step further about, does something work? Well, we're not just interested, right, in a measure like 5A, the 80% time in general education classroom, we're also interested in, well, what is the impact overall on student performance and student achievement? Again, you're right, I'm a measurement person. There's all these limitations with these measures. I get that. But still, do we see that districts participating in a systems improvement project, do we actually see them also seeing growth in, for instance, their English language arts and math scores? And here's two intriguing things that we find when we look at that data. The first thing we find is yes, overall, we do see improvements, right, in um, the test data associated with both English and math. But what's more intriguing, and this actually gets just a little bit to how it works, what's more intriguing is that we see greater improvements in growth over the same time frame for those districts that have been engaged longer in a systems improvement project. Okay, this actually really conforms to what we know about systems change. Where systems change isn't instant. Just because you have a meeting and you set things up, you're not going to suddenly see total transformation of what happens in your work, right? But we know that if you stay with a process, that people do in fact see change. I think what's important then about knowing if something works is to know that, hey, there is hope. Change can truly occur. There can be transformation, there can be real opportunities to advance what's happening for students, both in their placement and then ultimately in their performance. Great question from Julie. This is actually all students, not just those with IEPs. So that's a really great question. So yes, can we look at it both ways. This data is actually looking overall in those on those districts. So that's an important dynamic. And of course, there's lots of additional analysis. Here's what I'd like to do because we're about to transition from how it works from does it work to how it works is can I do our first little discussion breakout? And I want us to answer two questions. Okay. What is the information that has been confirmatory or disconfirmatory so far to your prior beliefs? And secondly, pose the questions you're starting to have that, to each other about, well, here is additional questions that come up for me. And let's see if we can do that. We're going to put you into groups of 3 or 4, and we'll do that for about 3.5 minutes. All right. Well, welcome back. Okay. So drop in the chat. Tell me how'd your breakouts go? Hope it wasn't too chaotic. Everyone had an opportunity to have a little discussion. We're going to do it one more time. So you get another chance to look forward to that. Um, Again, though, we've been really focusing so far on does something work? I mean, these are the questions I'm asked all the time as an evaluator. People want to know whether something works. And that's a great question. It actually feeds into there are 3 purposes actually that people generally talk about in terms of why people do evaluation. Okay, get ready for this. This is the use of evidence part. So there are generally 3 reasons we do evaluation. Reason number one, which is often most prominent, is what I call decision support or judgment. It's the question of does something work? Should we continue funding? Should we continue to do something? It's judging whether it works. Question 2 is often about improvement. Can we improve our current practices? Right? Is the second reason we typically do evaluation and we gather data is to improve practices. And number 3 is we want to learn sort of general knowledge. So we use evaluation in the context of research to use general knowledge. Now I tell you this, right? Because one of the things I have found is that you can't muddy the 3. Then when you collect data for improvement, right, you have to use it for improvement. When you collect data to judge whether something works, you have to use it for that purpose. When you collect data in a way that's about extending general knowledge, you use it in that purpose. And when you try to cross, creates all kinds of confusion when you try to cross paths. The great example of that actually is teacher evaluation, right? So we tend to do teacher evaluation for the purpose of judging how well a person is doing. That's a decision. When we try to use teacher evaluation for the purpose of improvement, it's not as well received, right? Because it confounds the dynamics. And actually, when the stakes are high, people give different answers than if they know that it's purely for an improvement purpose. Now, if you collect data on teachers for purely improvement purposes, like, yay, we want to help you improve, but then suddenly you use it for decision support to judge, right? Everyone gets upset. And it's reasonably so, because you get a different type of information you're telling people you're trying to improve. Now, I tell you this because it also really leads to this question of, are we simply trying to find out whether something works, or are we trying to really identify if we can understand how it works? And so, yes, if you get involved in strategies that advance inclusion through a project like SIP that's just about system improvement, you may in fact then find that you really want to know. Sorry, I was moving slides. You really want to know how it works that actually changes occur. So, what are the things that actually move us forward in ways that transform inclusion practices and increase student achievement in this realm? And so I want to give you two types of ways I've thought about this. This all comes from case studies of LEAs and school districts that have been successful, right, in advancing inclusion. And that means belonging, it means student performance. So it means those indicators, but it also means qualitatively that they have also indicate that they have been successful. And so this evidence comes from those case studies, okay, of what happens in districts that are successful. And then there's really two types of things that we've focused on. The first is there's a set of well-known school change strategies that come up when you study what works or how something works in relationship to advancing inclusion. And so the first I'm going to present those, and then I want to talk with you about strategies that are very specific to inclusion, that aren't just sort of general good school leadership, good educational practice strategies. So the things we know that we heard that really align with past research on what makes for really good school change efforts are as follows, that also align with these districts that did good inclusion practices. Number one, they build underlying structures that enable inclusion in education. Okay, so this is about, the infrastructure of classrooms. This is about teachers. This is about master scheduling. But they build an underlying structure that enables inclusive education. So, consistent with past research, good schools develop good infrastructure, good organizational structure, good human resource processes, right? They have good basic structures in place. It's hard to really advance things if your school is struggling with basic infrastructure elements. Okay, so it's hard. And so we're just acknowledging that that's sort of a precursor, but we know that to be true from past research. Second, we know that leadership mindset and the culture of a school matter, right? As a Peter Singer, it says, that culture takes strategy to lunch every day, right? That you have to have that mindset and the way people think about, whether it's growth, whether it's to be included, it really matters. And the culture that you have within a school is super important. Things like who is championing this. One of the things that is very clear is that just like in other change processes in schools, principal leadership is a super important component of advancing a school environment as it relates. In fact, it is a necessary component, I would say. So too are the champions that really advance inclusion specifically. They could be teachers on special assignment, they could be a general education teacher, they could be a special education teacher, but champions matter. And so too does the broader school culture's willingness and the general orientation of that culture. But we know this to be true. So this is true of all school change efforts, right? You need champions, you need good leadership mindset, you need good culture in terms of making transformation. Third, it's also true that, data-driven and continuous improvement efforts are really important to driving change. Of course, that's true not just for inclusion, right? It's true for schools and other elements. But the schools that we saw that did well, right, they really use LRE, strategically placing people, academic data to drive daily instruction. They do all of those things, right, to sustain momentum. We're going to get to some specifics of how districts do that in a minute, but we know that the use of data is meaningful and important. Now, of course, I could go into some great depth talking with you about, what types of data should we use? Well, we should use data that are what I call proximal. That means they're close to students, they're close to teachers. The further, when it's last year's data, when it's last semester's data, it's less proximal. If it's not specifically about these students, it's less proximal. So the proximity of data is important. Using data that's salient to people is super important. If they know that it was collected on them and then you're using it and giving back to them, it's very different than a sort of abstract, broad data. So the type of data, these are things we know. And then finally, ultimately, yes, we know that cross-role collaboration and shared leadership matter a lot. We're not going to be successful unless we break down traditional barriers and boundaries. Schools remain places that have silos. These are probably things you all know, right? This is hard to do, but these are things we know, right? That we have to create shared ownership with people. If we have a set of teachers who are foundationally against inclusion, it's pretty hard. If we have a set of administrators who are split in their commitment, it's hard. So cross-role collaboration and shared leadership are certainly really important to thinking about this. But these are things that are sort of generally true across all school settings in terms of creating change and advancing a school environment. Okay, so they're not specific or really unique to inclusion. I think that is a really important point to make. These are about good school leadership, about good efforts, which then takes us to, we're going to take a breath, okay? It takes us to what specifically do successful schools do to advance inclusion in their environments? How's everybody feeling? We okay? I start to worry when I'm talking for too long. That's what I would say. We're just having a little metacognitive break here. Okay, so let's talk about specific strategies. Well, the first one maybe isn't a surprise because it connects directly to the idea of infrastructure. But one thing that we have come to hear just consistently and really came out in case study data is that the master schedule is so important to inclusion. But not only that, it is how this happens. So I love this quote. We started building the master schedule around special education, with special education going in first, and then building general education around special education. Whoa, yeah. That is a different approach, right? Then we build a master schedule and then we add special education to it. So earlier we said scheduling matters, but here I'm saying something really different. I'm saying there is a way that successful schools have done this to really transform the environment. Okay. The second thing I want to share is that this scheduling gets really detailed. Okay. This is about making maximum use of your team, and so you're moving teaching assistants, aides from classroom to classroom where they're needed. You're setting breaks so that teachers and students can have breaks. You're really organizing, and some of the materials that SIP could share with you from demonstration sites about what makes a master schedule a really good master schedule are you should that's a follow-up, right? Because this is such an important component of how we then organize everything else as a foundation. So master scheduling as a really important specific strategy for inclusion. Um, Second, classified staff are core to the work of inclusion. So how we provide support, make them feel included, and specifically here is targeted support for those classified staff. So how about structured mentorship and release time that really improves the instructional skills of those aides to create inclusive settings? This isn't just about teachers. This is about having to make sure that we know that those instructional aid staff are fully integrated. I love the example from one location that said, we have classified staff on special assignment who are providing ongoing professional learning for all of our classified staff. That is a core component of how we think about and how we go about creating inclusive environments. That's such a fantastic example of, you know, the allocation of specific resources in a way that's meaningful, right, to transform practices. I think that's a really fantastic way of thinking about what this means for a group, right, that can be underappreciated, underpaid, and all of those things. How do you really show value in a meaningful way? That's a very specific inclusion practice. Okay, so number two. Now let me pause for a second and ask you a question. How are you feeling about confirming and disconfirming evidence? How many of you, when I start to talk about really dedicating resources to paraprofessionals and classified staff, are like, oh, wow, we just had a different conversation? Or you said, okay, wow, getting all the principals to do special education first in the master scheduling process, that's going to be a lift, right? Like we sort of move from like, oh, we can do all these things. These all sound reasonable to like very specifically, it becomes more of a challenge. All right. Let's then talk about redefining special education roles. I want to tell you about this study that I did up in Northern California, and we were looking at attitudes related to special education. And one of the things that and inclusion, and one of the things that we found was that the one of the biggest resistor groups to inclusive environments was special education teachers themselves, who were really
Yeah.
concerned about their students and what experiences they would have if they were no longer their students, but they were shared as students in general education settings. Powerful, which is why I say that successful districts have really made efforts to redefine special education roles. I love this quote again. I took the FTEs from self-contained classrooms and made those into resource teachers for entire buildings. So the way that this district talked to me about this was they really said, instead of having teachers in those self-contained classrooms, we changed their role to be a building role that served all students, whether they were special education students or they were general education students. That way, every general education teacher and every other special education teacher in that building had a resource support, right? Where we redefined their role from working in a single classroom to working across the building to provide supports using those skills that they have, right? To do individualized instruction, to specifically work across different contexts, to really transform practices across the building. That is the transformation of roles. And that is some of the really unique work that has happened in schools that have been really successful in creating more inclusive environments. Okay, that, right? I know that that is can be a challenging. That can like, wow, can you pull that off in your environment? So that's a really powerful way to do that. All right. Fourth, let's talk about specific data-driven conversations. We mentioned this before as a general practice, but what about specific to creating a more inclusive environment? Again, I love the quote. I keep an LRE chart in my office. I have it up on the wall. We talk about it in relationship to the building. I meet quarterly. We talk about it. We use live data every single time. This isn't the abstract use of data. This is putting data front and center as a way to remind people of goals and goal setting associated with creating inclusive spaces. And to use that as a way to keep it in people's mind really was the idea. That instead of it being, oh, well, this comes up when we have a meeting, they're continually trying to use data as a way to remind people of where they're headed, to get a progress report. I'm going to go back for a minute to my example of two things I've said earlier. One, proximal data matters, and my sleep journey. Okay. So one of the things I didn't tell you about my sleep journey is that I was wearing this watch, right? Because we all have wearable devices now. And my wearable device would give me feedback every single night about my sleep score. And so I was able to track my progress on a daily basis to get information back. You remember how I said proximal data matters, right? Being reminded of data relative to a goal or aspiration. So that's really what we're talking about here is we're using data to help us to orient ourselves to continuously improve. Now, I use that word improve intentionally, right? Because I'm kind of connected back to that purpose of data, right? Sometimes we use data to judge. No, here we're using it to improve. We're driving an improvement process by keeping data front and center, by using information that is close to people so they're reminded of where we're at and where we're trying to head to. So those data-driven conversations aren't abstract data, they're specific data. They're reminding us of our key objectives. How are we feeling? Should we have another pause? My dad was a pastor, so I've been accused of taking on a pastoral tone when I do talks. I sort of the rise and the fall of the voice and all those things. And I'm trying to entertain you, number one, because I said that was a goal at the beginning. But I can get accused of being professorial and going on too much. So I want to be careful of that. We have four more specific things though that I want to cover. So sometimes when we, as professional leaders in schools, when we think about doing training for our professional peers, we forget some of the good practices we learn about working with students. For instance, why do we think that a one-size-fits-all model of professional development will actually move us forward when everyone actually is arriving at a very different place in terms of their professional learning and their professional needs? So again, something that districts that have been really successful with their inclusion journeys do is they create context or need-specific professional learning. They tailor what people need, they give them what they need. So one site needs information on working with autistic students. Let's do training for them on that. Another group of teachers needs something different. Another individual does something different. Let's actually use the core concept of tailoring instruction or individualized approach in the same context of our professional learning, right? So I think this is a really important strategic element to think about how you go about your professional learning and are you really addressing key needs, right? And I know we invest a lot in this, and so this is a challenge. But I think it really one of the things we heard was that context specific professional learning really is important. Six, where students are matters. There is just no question about this. We send powerful messages when we put students in those portable classrooms over there. We send really powerful messages. We send really power. So we one of the things we definitely saw in successful districts is they actually transform the locations where inclusion is happening. The location matters. Now, we can think about the location as a location on campus. That's important, right? That's super important on an individual campus. I also want to comment, we can think about this at which schools in a district this happens in. So one of the things I know very well is that there is more variation between than right? There's often really big differences in one school to another school within a district. So one school might be doing really great, another school isn't necessarily doing as well. So I want you to consider both within campus, right? Because that's often where we're thinking about, but also like between dynamics between buildings, where one is way ahead, one is not as far ahead. These things really matter. Everybody knows, by the way. Everybody knows. Everybody knows within a campus, and everybody knows between campuses if this is the school you go to as compared to that being the school you go to. So those things really we found to be powerful. We mentioned this before, but we really see that the breaking down of barriers between support services and special education, for instance, is incredibly important. So these barriers which have existed for so long become particularly important in bridging learning opportunities for students. We can talk just simply about co-teaching, right? And what makes co-teaching a dynamic here. We can talk about additional supports and how that happens. So the roles and the bridging of those roles becomes a really important dynamic in specifically transforming the successful schools. Again, it's generally specific, but this becomes more context specific. And last, but not least, in this is this idea of every student is a general education student. You hear it and many people say it. I just want to say that this is specifically coming from these case studies. where one of the biggest transformations that the case specifically saw was when they made the move to provide every student with a roster spot and to treat every student as a general education student. This is often a moment of transformation for success. Okay. So some of you are there, you're nodding your heads, you're saying, yes, we know this to be true. Some of you may not be there yet, but I think this is two things. It literally is the placement component, but it also is a mindset shift. And the mindset shift may be more powerful than the placement shift in some important ways. For instance, your CBO suddenly realizing that every student who is a special education student comes with general education dollars. Okay, they don't just come with special education dollars that are attached to it. They come with general education. So every student should have a seat. And this is so important. Obviously, there's lots of behind the scenes work. It is a mindset shift, and then it is a practical dynamic for every teacher, which is an expression of that mindset. Okay. I want to put you in a breakout one more time, and I want you to think about the same question, which is what information have you heard that is really confirming what you know? And what challenged you? And then this time I want you to ask one further question, and we'll put this in the chat so you have it. But the third question is, what might you do differently as a result of hearing this confirming and disconfirming information? Is there one practice you think you could adopt that might be important for your journey? Is there something that you're going to have to learn more about because you're like, I don't know that I agree with that? But these are, trying to identify both common practices for districts that have been successful that are about good school leadership, and then taking that to a more specific level and saying this is what schools that have been successful have actually done. And so, Caitlin, if we can drop people into the chats and we'll drop the into the groups, we'll spend about 5 minutes on this, and then we'll come back and we'll have a few minutes for questions. Okay?
Awesome. I'm going to open up the rooms now. Thank you so much, Dr. Wall. Everybody give Dr. Wall some love in the chat. You gave us some really concrete things out of some data that might be considered obtuse for people. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thank you, everyone.